after we had to temporarily suspend operations on the 16th of April because 3 of our staff were killed in North Darfur, or 40% of the population is facing hunger and may not know where their next meal will come from. If this conflict continues, an additional up to 2.5 million people will be facing food insecurity, and humanitarian needs will just go higher and higher if the fighting does not stop.
On the 15th of April 2023, a war broke out in the western part of Sudan, particularly in Darfur and Khartoum, which is the capital city of the nation. Citizens had no clue that what was going on, what they should do in the situation. Within moments, this war took a dreadful turn where citizens saw ashes and fire in the capital city. Few civilians died as they got into the crossfiring between Sudan's National Army and the RSF. With this awful sight, it marked the beginning of Sudan crisis. With this, the world also got to know the reason behind the turmoil in the country, which is the war between the National Army and the paramilitary forces, which is also known as by the name of RSF or Rapid Support Forces. Sudan is a country known for its hospitable people and its mineral wealth. Then what has turned this mineral-rich nation into a battleground? Till now, due to the ongoing war, approximately 700,000 people have been displaced within 15 days into the war. Let's have a discussion with experts, diplomats and researchers around the world to know the reason behind this turmoil, how it all got started, and mainly to know that why two different forces of the same country are in a conflict, and where is this war leading the resourceful rich Sudan to? Can you tell to the viewers that what is the current humanitarian situation in Sudan?
Current situation in Sudan is very, very dire. We're looking at a catastrophe on top of what was already a humanitarian crisis. So before the conflict even erupted, around 1/3 of the population needed some form of humanitarian assistance. And now we've just done a new food security assessment as WFP, estimating that up to 19 million people, or 40% of the population, is facing hunger and may not know where their next meal will come from. It was already a very, very dire situation before, with at least 1/3 of the population, as I mentioned, needing some form of humanitarian assistance. And now we're seeing these numbers spike up to 2 to 2.5 million more people being pushed into hunger because of the ongoing fighting. And it's making it very, very difficult for aid agencies to work inside Sudan because of the ongoing insecurity. So the situation is extremely, extremely tough.
Are there any food shortages in the country right now, and how is WFP planning to overcome these shortages?
This is an immense challenge because of the ongoing insecurity. We do have a lot of food pre-positioned in the country, around 80,000 metric tons, which we had in different warehouses across the country. We also are expecting the arrival of different ships with food commodities, both food for emergency assistance as well as treatment of malnutrition. It's kind of like a peanut paste that helps treat malnutrition for children. The biggest issue is the humanitarian access. So we just restarted distributions after we had to temporarily suspend operations on the 16th of April because 3 of our staff were killed in North Darfur. So last week, we lifted that temporary suspension and restarted distributions. In 4 states in Sudan. So far, we've been able to restart, which are states in the east, which are relatively more secure compared to Khartoum and the Darfurs.
The nutrition centers that you have been mentioning about, where are they at the moment in the country? Are they equally being distributed, or they are concentrated at few locations at the moment?
Now we're working in nutrition centers in Port Sudan. Because it's one of the safe areas. We're looking at other locations where we can start those programs up again. But in general, those 1,000 nutrition centers that I mentioned, we had been working in before the start of this conflict, were scattered across the country, and many of them in the Darfur.
While conducting such operations where the organizations like WFP have to provide food to the population, especially in a conflict like this, are there any security concerns that the team has to face, and what is the roadmap to cope up with these security concerns?
So the safety and security of our staff is one of our foremost concerns. If our staff is not safe, then we cannot deliver assistance. So at the very beginning of the conflict, especially when the fighting broke out in Khartoum, WFP and a lot of other UN agencies and humanitarian organizations relocated staff. So now we have our core team of staff working out of Port Sudan, which is a relatively secure area in compared to very much the opposite of what's happening in Khartoum. So we're looking at these safe areas where our staff can work from. We have national staff in Jazeera, for example, and in these 4 states that I mentioned where we're resuming operations. We've also had to relocate staff from the Darfurs, some into Chad. And so we can only resume operations in some of these areas when the security situation allows. And we're consistently doing security assessments to ascertain when and where we can start distributions in as many locations as possible.
A lot of people are getting displaced due to the ongoing war in Sudan. Where are these people heading to? Are they heading to South Sudan, Chad, Ethiopia, or Egypt? Reason being, most of these neighboring countries of Sudan are already undergoing some kind of turmoil. So will these countries be willing to take these refugees or asylum seekers who are coming to the country? And how are we aiming to protect these people out there?
It's a very difficult situation. So we have over 20,000 people, maybe even up to 30,000 now reported crossing the border into Chad. Some are crossing into Egypt. And we also see movements of people into South Sudan, which are both South Sudanese refugees who were in Sudan, but are returning back to South Sudan, as well as a small number of Sudanese refugees now crossing into South Sudan. There are also some movements into Ethiopia, and the challenge with providing assistance on these borders is that the region was already facing so many issues, as you mentioned, with the crisis in Tigray and Ethiopia. And also our operations in other countries, such as Chad and South Sudan, are also significantly underfunded. So for our operations in South Sudan, before this influx of refugees from Sudan, we required 466 million US dollars. Same in Chad, over $150 million requirement to meet the needs that were already existing. And now this additional flow of people and people who need assistance are further stretching those resources.
What do you think will be the final outcome of this war? Where is this war leading Sudan to at the moment? Reason being, considering the fight right now, there are a lot of fatal possibilities. So what do you think will be the final outcome of the war?
We're predicting in the next 3 to 6 months, we're projecting that if this conflict continues, an additional up to 2.5 million people will be facing food insecurity, and humanitarian needs will just go higher and higher if the fighting does not stop. So as a humanitarian agency, we are calling for an immediate ceasefire, a cessation of hostilities, because it is just going to make the situation so much harder for the Sudanese people and also for aid agencies to respond to these rising needs. So the number one thing is that the conflict absolutely has to stop.
Any final message to the viewers out there for the people of Sudan?
I would really encourage all viewers to keep an eye on Sudan. And also, I really have to say, I lived there for 2.5 years before this conflict erupted. The Sudanese people have such an amazing spirit of generosity and kindness. And I would really encourage anyone who's watching to try to find out more about the Sudanese people, what they have been going through in the last years, because of the governance situation, because of politics. But also there's an amazing cultural scene in Sudan. You have tons of musicians and artists. And so I would just encourage the world to keep caring about these people that I have become very good friends with, and that just have such beautiful hearts, and that are unfortunately in this situation that is beyond their control.